My daughter-in-law left her phone on my kitchen counter, and what I saw on that screen put me on the floor. Monique had stopped by that Wednesday afternoon the way she sometimes did, unannounced, warm, carrying herself like a woman doing a kindness. We sat with tea for nearly 40 minutes. She asked how I was sleeping. I told her fine. She said Jerome sent his love. I said tell him to call his mother himself. We both laughed. When she left, the room felt the way it always did after her visits. Pleasant enough, but somehow lighter without her in it. I noticed the phone almost immediately. It was sitting face down on the counter near the sugar bowl. I picked it up to call out before she reached the car. The screen lit up before I could move. A notification banner dropped from the top, a message preview, visible without unlocking anything. I was not trying to read it. I read it anyway, because the contact photo in the corner of that banner stopped every thought I had ever had in my life. My name is Beverly Tyndall. I am 53 years old. I have lived in Memphis my whole life, buried my father in this city, built a catering business in this city, and 4 years ago I buried my husband Monroe in this city too. I grieved that man the way you grieve someone you loved completely, which is to say badly, and for a long time. The face in that contact photo was Monroe's face, not a memorial picture, not the soft image I kept on the hallway table for 3 years before I finally turned it face down because I could not keep walking past it. This face was current, heavier through the jaw, the temples graying differently than I remembered. A man who had been somewhere living, eating, aging, while I was here weeping at his grave. If you are watching this and you think you know where this is going, stay with me. Because I promise you, I did not know. Not yet. The contact name was not Monroe. It was something ordinary, forgettable, the kind of name that means nothing to someone glancing at a phone. But that face, 28 years of mornings across a breakfast table. I would know that face in the dark. Later, I would learn Monique had transferred her contacts to a newer phone only months earlier. At the time, I did not know that. All I knew was that whoever owned that number had Monroe's face attached to it. For one desperate second, I tried to explain it away. An old photograph, a resemblance, some strange coincidence my grief was turning into something bigger than it was. Then I looked at the message. The message in the preview read, "Has she noticed anything yet? We are running out of time. Whatever time you are watching this, whether it is morning, afternoon, or you cannot sleep and it is past midnight, I need you to stay right here with me." I grabbed the counter. My vision went narrow at the edges. My chest pulled tight the way it does when your body understands something before your mind is willing to. 4 years. 4 years of black dresses and sympathy cards and people telling me Monroe was at peace. And here was his face on our daughter-in-law's phone, attached to a message asking if I had noticed anything yet. I did not know exactly what I was looking at, but I knew it was not innocent. I knew Monique was connected to something she had never told me. And for the first time since Monroe's funeral, I felt the terrifying possibility that the story I had been living with for 4 years was not the truth. I heard her footsteps on the porch steps. Something in me moved before I decided anything. I put the phone down exactly where I found it, turned to the sink, gripped the edge of it with both hands until my knuckles steadied. Monique came in, apologized, took the phone. She looked at my face for 1 second longer than she needed to. I told her I was just running water for dishes. She left. The moment that door closed, I slid down the cabinet and sat on my kitchen floor. I sat there until the light through the window changed color. Then I got up, washed my face, and started dinner like it was any other evening. I did not cry. I opened the kitchen drawer and took out a notepad. I sat down at the table, opened it to the first page, and wrote one word at the top: evidence. I had spent 4 years being a woman people felt sorry for. That ended the night I wrote the word evidence at the top of a blank page. I did not confront Monique. I did not call Jerome. I did not breathe a word of what I had seen to a single living soul. What I did was something I had never done in 28 years of marriage. I started paying attention to everything I had been too trusting to notice before. Monique came by again that Friday. I made tea the same way I always did, sent her home with a plate the same way I always did, and sat across from her at my kitchen table like a woman who had nothing on her mind but the weather and her aching knees. But I was reading her the entire time. I noticed how she shifted the moment I mentioned the catering business. Not dramatically, just a small pivot. A subject change dressed up as a question about my health. I mentioned the rental property on Decatur and watched her fingers tighten once around her mug before she relaxed them. She checked her phone twice during our conversation. Both times, she angled the screen away from me before looking at it. I noticed all of it. I said nothing. What unsettled me more than Monique was Jerome. When I let myself think back clearly, I realized he had been coming by far more than usual for the past several months. Always with a reason. Always pleasant. Always carrying some paper that needed my signature. Something routine, he would say. Just housekeeping. Nothing to worry yourself about. I had signed without reading because he was my son, and I was still the kind of woman who trusted her son. I was standing at the sink one evening, 3 days after I found that phone, when the full weight of that settled on me. 3 documents in 2 months. I could not tell you what a single one of them said. I dried my hands. I went to the filing cabinet in the back bedroom. I pulled everything I had signed in the past 2 years and spread it across the kitchen table under the lamp. Every lease renewal, every insurance form, every letter I had put my name to. I read each one from the beginning. Most of it I recognized. The dates matched my memory. The content made sense. The signature felt like mine. But there were 2 documents I had no memory of at all. My signature was on both of them. Clear, unhurried. But I could not place a single detail. Not the day. Not where I was sitting. Not who handed me the pen. That kind of absence is not ordinary forgetfulness. I know my own life. I know what I have and have not done. Jerome called while I was still sitting with those papers. He asked how I was doing. I told him fine. He asked if I needed anything. I told him no. Then I asked, lightly, the way you ask about the weather, how things were going with the business. He said good, steady, nothing to report. But there was a half-second pause before good that would not have meant anything to me a week ago. It meant something to me now. After we hung up, I sat back down at the table and looked at both documents again. Then I went to the drawer where I keep old birthday cards and personal letters, and I pulled out one I had written in my own hand about 6 years ago. I set it beside the 2 documents. I got out the magnifying glass I use for prescription bottles. I looked at all 3 signatures under that lens for a long time. They were close. Whoever did this had studied my handwriting carefully. But they were not the same. The accountant's hesitation told me everything before he spoke a single word. I called him on a Tuesday morning. Not through Jerome, directly, from the number on the old business card I found in my father's desk drawer. His name was on that card. I had never called him myself. In 2 years of Jerome managing the books, I had never once picked up that phone. That alone sat heavy in my chest as I dialed. I asked him for a full financial report on the catering business going back 4 years. There was a pause on the line that lasted just a beat too long. Then he said he would start pulling the records immediately and send me a preliminary review as soon as possible. Professional. Careful. The kind of careful that tells you a man already knows something is wrong and has been waiting for someone to ask. The preliminary report arrived 2 days later. I sat down with it at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and I did not get up until I had read every page. My father built that business over 40 years. He started with a folding table and a borrowed pot, and he built something that fed this family and employed people from our community and carried his name through 4 decades of Memphis. When I inherited it, I thought the greatest thing I could do was protect it. I handed it to my son because I was grieving and exhausted, and I believed that was protection enough. What I was reading told me I had handed my father's life's work to the wrong person. The money had not disappeared through carelessness. It had been redirected, deliberately, consistently, with enough structure to suggest someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Monthly transfers going to an account I did not recognize. Payments to vendor names I had never heard of for services I could find no record of. A salary line for a position that did not exist in any version of the business I had ever known. The clear fraud ran 3 years deep, the transfers growing larger as they went. But further back, the earlier records looked different, murkier, harder to pin down. Transactions that could pass for legitimate expenses if nobody was looking with the right eyes. I wrote that down, separately. Those early records needed someone sharper than me to untangle them. What I could read clearly was this. The redirection started 6 months before Monroe's accident. I set the report down on the table. I did not slam it. I did not make a sound. I sat in my quiet kitchen and let that land the way it needed to land. Not as a surprise, because somewhere underneath everything I had already started to understand, but as a confirmation that changed the shape of the last 4 years entirely. Monroe was sitting at this table, eating the breakfast I cooked him while he was doing this. He was kissing me goodbye at that door while he was doing this. He let me hold his hand at my father's funeral while he was already moving money out of what my father left me. I picked up the phone and called Jerome. I kept my voice easy. I told him I had been thinking about bringing in an outside auditor, just to make sure everything was in good order, nothing to worry about, just good business practice. I heard the change in him before he said a word. When he spoke, his answer came 2 beats too fast. He said that was completely unnecessary, that he had everything handled, that I should not be stressing myself over things he was already taking care of. I thanked him and told him I would think about it. The moment the call ended, I dialed the accountant back. I told him I needed everything. Every transaction, every transfer, every vendor payment going back 5 years. I wanted the full review, however long it took. And I gave him a new email address, one I had created that morning, one Jerome had never seen and would never find. My father paid off that duplex in 2008. I watched him make the final payment. He sat at this same kitchen table, wrote the check himself, and said, "Beverly, nobody can touch what you own, free and clear." He believed that. I believed it with him. I called the bank on a Thursday morning, the same week the financial report came in. I was not expecting anything. I was pulling threads, the way you do when you already know something is unraveling, but you have not yet found where it started. I gave the woman my account information and asked for the current status on the line of credit attached to the Decatur duplex. She told me there was an outstanding balance of $64,000. I asked her to repeat that. She did. $64,000, drawn against the property over a period of 3 years. The most recent draw was 14 months ago, which meant 3 months after Monroe's funeral. Someone had walked into that arrangement and pulled money out of a property my father spent decades paying off, using my name to do it. I asked who had authorized the draws. She said, the account holder. My name was on that account. So was Monroe's. I asked if she could tell me anything further. She said I would need to submit a formal records request for the authorization documents. I submitted it before I left the kitchen that morning. 2 days later, an envelope arrived. I set it on the table and opened it slowly, the way you open something when part of you already knows what is inside and needs a moment before the knowing becomes real. My signature was on every authorization form, 6 of them, each one clear, unhurried, written by a hand that knew exactly what it was doing. The dates stretched back 3 years. I spread them across the table and looked at each one under the lamp. I have never signed a single one of these forms. I have never authorized a single draw against that property. Not once. Not for any reason. That duplex was sacred to me the way my father's tools were sacred to him. You do not borrow against what someone bled to leave you. I sat very still for a long time. This was not sloppy. Whoever did this did not rush. They studied my signature carefully enough to put it on bank paperwork and have it accepted more than once over 3 years. They knew the account. They knew the property. They knew enough about my financial life to move through it like they belonged there. The only people who knew that much about my financial life were Monroe and Jerome. Monique arrived that afternoon while I was still sitting with the documents. I folded them into the envelope and put them in the back bedroom before I opened the door. I made coffee. I smiled the smile I had been practicing all week, warm, tired, unsuspecting. I asked her sweetly whether Jerome had been busy lately. She said work had been very demanding. I nodded and asked whether he had been dealing with much paperwork these days. She said she honestly was not sure. She did not really get involved in his work details. The answer was too smooth, too ready. That was not a wife who had not thought about the question. That was a woman who had prepared for a version of it. I walked her to the door. I told her to drive safe. I watched her car until it turned the corner. Then I went inside, picked up my phone, and dialed the number I had gotten from the Tennessee Bar Association's attorney referral line 3 days ago. A private attorney. I had never called a lawyer in my life. My hand did not shake once. Alton Whitmore did not react the way most people react when something is wrong. He did not wince. He did not shake his head. He read through everything I brought him. The financial report, the bank authorization forms, the 2 documents from my filing cabinet with the signatures that were not quite mine. And when he finished, he set it all down in a neat stack and looked at me across his desk like a man who had seen this before and was not going to insult me by pretending otherwise. He told me that after our first conversation, he had started reviewing the public property filings connected to my assets and requesting records tied to several of the accounts mentioned in the financial report. What he found was not encouraging. Jerome had filed a quit-claim deed on the second rental property, the 3-bedroom house on the east side that my father bought in 1994, the one I had been renting out for 11 years without a single problem. The deed transferred ownership from Beverly Tyndall to Jerome Tyndall. It was filed at the Shelby County Register of Deeds office 4 months ago. My signature appeared on the deed. I did not sign that deed. He slid a copy across the desk so I could see it. I looked at my name on that line and felt something move through me that I do not have a clean word for. Not just anger. Something older and more fundamental than anger. The feeling of being erased from something that was yours before you were old enough to know what ownership meant. There was also a change of beneficiary form on the business insurance policy. Filed 7 months ago. It redirected the payout from me to Jerome. My signature on that too. Alton said the words quietly and without decoration. Deed fraud. Forgery. Both criminal offenses under Tennessee law. He told me we needed to move carefully. If Jerome or Monique understood that I knew, the assets still in my name could be moved or complicated before anything could be frozen legally. I listened to all of it. Then I asked him as evenly as I could what the legal position would be if a person declared dead turned out to still have some connection to marital finances. I kept it hypothetical. I said I was just trying to understand how these things worked. Alton stopped writing. He looked at me the way a careful man looks at a woman who is telling him something without saying it. He asked if there was something I needed to tell him. I looked back at him for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. Not yet, I said, but soon. He accepted that. He wrote something down and said we would talk again before the end of the week. I was sitting in my car outside his building when Jerome called. The sun was going down, and the street was quiet, and I watched people walking past on the sidewalk while my son's name lit up my screen. He was casual, easy, the way Jerome always was when he wanted something to feel like nothing. He said he had been thinking about making some improvements to the rental property, a fresh coat of paint, maybe look at the gutters, just keeping things maintained. He wanted to make sure I had no objection. He was asking my permission to improve a property he had already signed out of my name 4 months ago. I told him that sounded lovely. I told him to let me know what he found when he got in there. He said he would. He said goodnight. He said he loved me. I said I loved him too. When the call ended, I sat in the quiet of that car and opened my notepad to a clean page. I had written a lot of names and numbers and dates in these pages over the past 2 weeks, but I had not written this name. Not once. Not until now. I wrote Monroe. Underneath it, I wrote, he is alive. Underneath that, I wrote, prove it. I went back to Alton 2 days later and I told him everything. I started with the phone, the notification banner, Monroe's face in that contact photo. Current, alive looking, heavier through the jaw than the man I buried. I told him about the message I read without touching the screen. I told him about sliding down my kitchen cabinet and sitting on that floor until the light changed. I told him I had spent 3 weeks watching my daughter-in-law and documenting my son while carrying the weight of what I suspected alone, because I needed to be certain before I said it out loud to anyone. Then I said it out loud. I believe Monroe is alive. I told Alton about the face on the phone, the message asking whether I had noticed anything yet. The financial fraud that appeared to begin before Monroe's accident, the forged signatures, the property transfers, the strange coordination between Jerome and Monique. I told him I could not prove where Monroe was or what name he might be using, but I no longer believed the story I had been given 4 years ago. I watched Alton's face the entire time I spoke. He is a composed man. That composure is clearly something he has built deliberately over many years of sitting across from people in crisis. But something moved behind his eyes when I said Monroe's name. Something that told me even a careful man had his limits of what he expected to hear on a Thursday afternoon. He was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he picked up his pen. He told me that if Monroe was alive, what I was describing could involve insurance fraud, deed fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and wire fraud at minimum. He said federal involvement was possible because the financial transfers appeared to cross state lines. He told me the immediate priority was freezing the assets still legally in my name, the family home, the first rental property, the catering business, before Jerome could file anything further. He also told me I needed to contact the FBI, not Memphis police. The FBI specifically because of the interstate element and the nature of the financial crimes involved. I asked him how long all of this would take. He said months. He said it would require patience, precision, and complete silence on my part. Jerome and Monique could not know I was building anything. And if Monroe was alive, wherever he was, he could not know I was anything other than a grieving widow being slowly and quietly managed out of everything she owned. I nodded once. I told him I had been patient for 28 years without realizing that was what I was doing. A few more months was nothing new. Something shifted in Alton's expression when I said that. Not pity. Something closer to respect. Monique called that evening while I was driving home. She wanted to know if she could come for lunch that Saturday. Her voice was warm and easy, the way it always was. And I understood now that the warmth and the ease were not lies exactly, just a performance she had practiced long enough that she no longer noticed she was performing. I told her Saturday was perfect. I said I would make her favorite. I spent 20 minutes on that call being exactly the woman she and Monroe believed me to be. Soft, a little lonely, grateful for the company. When I hung up, I pulled over and wrote 3 new observations in my notepad before I forgot the details of her tone, I was home and in my kitchen with the lights low when Alton called back. He had already found something, a business loan, taken out 18 months before Monroe's accident. $312,000 borrowed against the catering company's assets. My signature on the personal guarantee. The form that made me legally responsible for the debt if the business could not pay. I had never heard of this loan. Not one word of it. Not the lender, not the amount, not the account it was paid into. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone and understood that the number on my evidence notepad was going to get much longer before this was over. Alton slid the photograph across his desk without saying a word. He did not prepare me for it. He did not say, "Here is something difficult," or "I need you to look at this carefully." He simply set it in front of me the way you set down something that speaks entirely for itself. And he waited. Monroe was standing near a truck in a driveway. The photograph was taken from a distance, a long lens, natural light. The kind of image that captures a person who does not know they are being seen. He was heavier than I remembered, the weight sitting differently across his shoulders. The hair at his temples had gone gray in a pattern I did not recognize, because I had not been there to watch it happen. He was wearing a jacket I had never seen. He looked ordinary, comfortable, like a man with nowhere particular to be and no particular weight on his conscience. I looked at that photograph for a long time. 4 years. 4 years of a grave I visited on his birthday, and on our anniversary, and on the mornings when I simply missed him too much to stay in the house. 4 years of Jerome sitting in the front pew at that funeral with his head bowed and his hand covering mine, knowing his father was alive in Georgia. 4 years of Monique asking how I was sleeping, whether I was eating, whether the grief was getting any lighter, knowing. 4 years of my church family holding my hands and telling me Monroe was at peace while he was somewhere building a new life on the money he had taken from mine. I folded the photograph in half. I put it in my purse. I looked up at Alton. I asked him what the next step was. He said they were ready to contact the FBI field office in Memphis. The investigators' documentation, combined with everything I had already gathered, gave them enough to open a formal investigation. From that point, the federal process would take over. I nodded. Then I asked him one more question. I asked whether Monroe would face more charges if he came back voluntarily versus being brought back through extradition. Alton looked at me steadily. He said extradition always results in a harder landing, more exposure, less goodwill from the court, fewer options for his attorneys to negotiate with. I told him then we would make sure it was extradition. Alton wrote something down and did not comment further. He understood. Jerome came by that evening without calling first. That was new. He had always called ahead before, always had a reason prepared, always arrived at a time that suited the story he was telling. Showing up unannounced meant something had shifted in him. Some pressure I could not yet see had started to push. He asked how I was. He looked at my face a little too carefully when he said it. We talked about nothing for 20 minutes. The weather, a neighbor's new fence, whether I'd been sleeping. Before he left, he mentioned casually that he might need me to sign a few more documents soon. Routine things, he said. Just keeping the business administration current. I smiled and told him, of course. Just let me know whenever he was ready. He hugged me at the door. I hugged him back. I stood in the hallway and listened to his car until I could not hear it anymore. Then I walked to my bedroom and opened the nightstand drawer. Monroe's funeral program had been in there for 4 years. I had not been able to throw it away before now. I picked it up and looked at it once. His name, his dates, the photograph they printed on the cover that I had chosen myself because I thought it looked most like him. I put it in the bin. I was done grieving a living man. The FBI agent sat across from me and Alton and spoke the way a person speaks when they have learned that plain language is the only kind that does not cause more damage than the truth itself. What they had found so far was not a man who made desperate decisions when things fell apart. It was not weakness or panic or debt that cornered him into something he never intended. What the financial forensics team had begun reconstructing from the records already recovered was a pattern suggesting a man who gradually crossed lines he never expected anyone to notice, then spent years convincing himself he could keep crossing them. Within the first 3 years, Monroe opened a business account. The name on it was close enough to my father's catering company to pass a casual glance. One word different, the same structure. At first, the activity appeared limited. Small transactions, irregular amounts, the sort of thing that could be explained away as bookkeeping confusion if someone asked the right questions early enough. By year 7 of our marriage, the amounts being redirected were no longer small. Those murky transactions I had flagged in the accountant's report, the ones I said needed a sharper eye than mine. This was what investigators believed they were. Not the beginning of the scheme, but the point where caution gave way to confidence. In year 9, he took out the first loan against my father's property. My signature on the application. Clean and practiced, and completely forged. The agent made it clear that the forensic review was still ongoing. But what had already been verified painted a picture that was difficult to mistake. Monroe never built a second life because he wanted to leave. He built it because leaving would have cost him access. The marriage gave him proximity to the business, the properties, the accounts, and the trust that made everything else possible. As long as he stayed, the money stayed within reach. I sat in that office and I listened to all of it without interrupting once. My father built his business from nothing. He acquired those properties through 40 years of discipline and sacrifice, and a refusal to let this city convince him his labor was worth less than it was. He trusted Monroe, because I loved Monroe. He shook that man's hand at our wedding and called him son. He died believing his daughter's husband was someone worthy of what he was leaving behind. Monroe began stealing from my father's legacy while my father was still alive to see us happy together. I wrote that in my notepad during the briefing. I closed it when I was done. I did not let myself stay inside that thought because there was still work to do and I could not afford to come apart now. That afternoon, I called Monroe's sister. I kept it light, just checking in, just talking the way we used to before grief made everything complicated. Midway through the conversation, I asked gently whether Monroe had ever mentioned money troubles in the period before his accident. She paused. Then she said he always seemed to be managing just fine. The pause before that answer lasted 3 full seconds. I counted them. After I hung up, I called Alton immediately. He told me the FBI had already spoken to her. She cooperated fully and without resistance. What she knew was circumstantial. She had noticed money Monroe could not easily explain but had never known its source. She would not be charged. I told Alton I understood, and I did not bring her up again. I was in bed that night, lights off, when the FBI agent called. The body in the burned car had been identified. A federal cold case DNA database had processed a new upload earlier that year and returned a match. At the time of Monroe's supposed accident, the remains were too severely degraded by the fire for the county medical examiner to make a positive identification. Personal effects recovered from the vehicle and the circumstances surrounding the crash led investigators at the time to classify the case as a presumed death with inconclusive remains rather than a confirmed identification. That determination had now been reopened. The man in that car had been reported missing from another county 6 months before Monroe's accident. Someone had found a body, put it in a car, burned it, and walked away into a new life. I lay in the dark after the agent hung up and stared at the ceiling. Every layer I had uncovered in the past several weeks had been worse than the one before it. But this was different. This was not fraud. This was not forgery. This was something I did not yet have a word for. 2 weeks earlier, I made a decision about the kind of woman I was going to be for the time remaining in this investigation. Not the woman I actually was, the woman they needed me to be, tired, overwhelmed, a widow finally buckling under the weight of everything she had been holding alone. I gave Monique the first piece at our Saturday lunch. I told her I had been thinking seriously about simplifying, that managing the properties and the business had become too much, that maybe it was time to let some of it go, liquidate what I could, and just rest. I made my voice sound like a woman who had finally stopped fighting something she could not carry anymore. I watched her face the entire time I said it. She did not react immediately. That was the tell. A person genuinely surprised takes a half-second to catch up. Monique took a controlled breath and arranged her expression into sympathy before she responded. Her eyes moved to the left just once. Quickly, almost imperceptibly, the way a person's eyes move when they are processing information they were already waiting for. She said all the right things. She said I deserved rest. She said Monroe would have wanted me to take care of myself. 3 days later, Jerome called. He was warm and concerned and full of helpful suggestions. He mentioned there was already a potential buyer for the business, a friend of a friend, completely trustworthy, someone who would take good care of what my father built. He said he could manage the entire process so I would not have to worry about a single detail. I told him I was grateful. I told him I would think about it. What I was actually doing was letting the recorder run. Alton had walked me through Tennessee's one-party consent law the week before. If I was a party to the conversation, I could record it without informing the other person. Jerome had now made 2 calls describing his authority over assets he had stolen on paper. Both recorded. Both documented. Both handed to the FBI contact along with my written notes from every visit Monique had made in the past month. Every piece of false information I fed them came back to me as evidence. Monique came for coffee 3 days after Jerome's call. She brought a plant, a small potted thing she set on my kitchen windowsill like a woman making herself at home. She was warmer than usual, more attentive, refilling my cup before I asked, asking twice whether I was sleeping well. The performance was so polished I might have found it impressive under different circumstances. I told her I had been having the strangest feeling lately, that sometimes in the house I felt Monroe nearby. That grief did things to a person's senses, I supposed. I smiled when I said it, soft, a little embarrassed, like a woman admitting something she was not sure she believed herself. Monique's hand went completely still on her coffee cup. It lasted exactly 1 second. Then she recovered and said she understood, that grief worked in mysterious ways, that Monroe's spirit was probably looking out for me. I smiled and said I supposed that was true. After she left, I sat at the table and added 4 new entries to my notepad. Every detail. The plant on the windowsill, the 2-second recovery, what she said about Monroe's spirit, and the careful way she said it. Alton called that evening. The quitclaim deed Jerome had filed on the rental property had been legally challenged and frozen pending investigation. The family home had been placed in a protective trust in my name alone. Both actions completed quietly, without alerting Jerome or Monique. Monroe could not touch my home from Georgia. Jerome could not touch my property from Memphis. For the first time in 4 years, everything that was mine was legally mine again. The FBI agent laid it out across the conference table like a map of a life I had never been shown. Gerald Warren. That was the name Monroe had been living under for 4 years in a mid-sized city in Georgia. Not a careless alias, a fully constructed identity. A Georgia contractor's license issued 3 years ago, a registered truck, a bank account with consistent deposits that the FBI's financial unit had traced back through a chain of transfers, connecting directly to the catering business redirections we had already documented. The same money, the same thread. Just moved far enough down the line that it arrived in Georgia looking clean. He had not been surviving on my money. He had been living on it. The house was modest, but well-maintained. Fresh paint, a kept yard. the kind of upkeep that costs time and money consistently applied. The truck was new. The credit card records attached to the Gerald Warren account showed restaurants, home furnishings, 2 domestic flights in the past 18 months. A man living a quiet, comfortable, ordinary life. On my father's money. The agent paused before the next part. I noticed the pause. She was watching my face when she told me there were regular transfers from Monroe's account to a second address in the same city. A separate account. A woman's name. Felicia Stafford. I kept my face exactly where it was. I asked how long the transfers to Felicia Stafford had been occurring. The agent said the records they had confirmed so far showed the transfers predating Monroe's supposed death by at least 6 years. Possibly longer. The earlier records were still being traced. 6 years. 6 years ago, I was making Monroe's breakfast every morning. I was sleeping beside him every night. I was the woman he came home to, the woman who kept his house and ran his family's business, and believed without question that the man across the table from me was exactly who he had always said he was. 6 years ago, he was already sending money to another address, already maintaining another life in another city while sitting at mine. I asked the agent for Felicia Stafford's address. She told me they could not share that information at this stage of the investigation. I nodded and did not ask again. I had her name. That was not enough to find a person by itself, but it was enough to start. Public records existed for a reason. Property filings existed for a reason. People leave traces whether they intend to or not. Finding those traces would take work, but work had stopped frightening me. Jerome called that afternoon. The warmth in his voice was thinner than it had been. The concerned son performance was wearing through at the edges. Underneath it, I could hear something tighter, something that needed this to move faster than it was moving. He asked if I had made a decision about the business sale. I told him I was leaning toward it but wanted to understand the process better before I committed. I asked him to walk me through exactly what signing everything over would involve. Who would handle the paperwork? What documents I would need to sign? How the transfer would be structured? He told me, in detail, all of it recorded. When the call ended, I sat at the kitchen table with my notepad open to a fresh page. I wrote Gerald Warren at the top. Underneath it, I wrote Felicia Stafford. Then I drew a single line from both names upward and connected them to one word above everything else. Monroe. I looked at what I had written for a long time, the whole shape of it, the years of it, the careful, patient construction of a man who had been living 3 lives simultaneously and believed not one of them would ever catch up with him. I wrote one more word at the bottom of the page. Soon. I found her on a Thursday evening sitting at my kitchen table with nothing but her name and the kind of patience that comes from having nothing left to be afraid of. Property records first, public filings second. Then a Facebook profile that was not locked the way it should have been. The kind of privacy gap that most people never think to close because they do not imagine anyone is looking. Felicia Stafford, 44 years old. A warm face, open and ordinary. The kind of face that makes you feel immediately that you have met her before somewhere. Her profile was full of the small, comfortable details of a regular life. A kitchen she had painted herself, a church program, a photograph from what looked like a family cookout with people laughing in the background. In several photos, there was a man beside her. Every single image was the same. His face angled away, partially turned, never quite caught full on. A shoulder here, a jaw there, the back of a head. In 28 years of marriage, I never once knew Monroe to be careless. He was not careless here either, but in one photograph, a birthday, balloons tied to a chair, a cake with candles, 2 children leaning in to blow. The man's face turned just enough. I looked at that photograph on my phone screen for a long time. Those children were 9 and 11 years old, which meant Monroe had been in Felicia Stafford's life for at least 11 years. 11 years ago, Monroe and I were celebrating our 17th wedding anniversary. I remember that evening clearly. He took me to dinner. He gave me gold earrings in a small velvet box and told me I was the best thing that had ever happened to him. I still have those earrings in my jewelry box. I have not been able to look at them directly since the day I found that phone on my counter. I set my phone face down on the table. I got up and found the kitchen timer, the old one, the one that belonged to my mother. I set it for 1 hour. Then I sat back down, and I let everything come. The grief for the 28 years. The rage at the specific, deliberate cruelty of a man who sat across from me on our 17th anniversary and looked me in the eye. The humiliation of understanding how completely and carefully I had been performed for. I let all of it move through me without pushing any of it away. When the timer went off, I washed my face. I made tea. I sat back down. Felicia Stafford did not know. The FBI's documentation made that clear. She was a woman Monroe had constructed a life around, not a partner in what he had done. She was not my enemy. She was another woman he had built something false on top of. The difference between us was only this. He robbed me, and he hid from her. Both of us had been deceived. Neither of us had deserved it. But he gave her children 11 years of a father. He gave me 28 years of a lie. I put that thought in its place and left it there. Monique arrived the next morning, her third visit in 10 days. She brought food and wore her concern like a coat. She asked whether I had spoken further with Jerome about moving forward. I told her I was nearly ready. I just wanted to make sure Jerome was fully protected through the process. I would hate, for anything, to come back on him legally once the paperwork was signed. I watched that sentence land on her, watched her work to keep her face from showing what it wanted to show. Alton called that evening. The FBI was ready to move. They needed my authorization to proceed with the arrests of Jerome and Monique. I gave it without hesitation. He told me to act like any other day tomorrow morning. I almost smiled. I was awake before the sun came up. I did not lie there fighting sleep the way I had in the early weeks of this. The weeks when knowing what I knew made the nights feel like something to survive. I lay in the dark, quietly. On my own side of a bed I had stopped thinking of as half empty. And I thought about my father. He used to say that a person's character is not what they do when life is going well. It is what they do when everything they built is standing at the edge of being taken from them. He said it more than once, in different ways, at different points in my life. I understood the words each time. I do not think I understood what they cost until now. I got up. I made coffee. I took it out to the back porch and sat in the dark while Memphis found its morning. The light coming slowly through the trees he planted in this yard the year I turned 9. The sound of the neighborhood beginning to move. A dog somewhere down the street. A car pulling out of a driveway, 3 houses down. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a city that had no idea what was about to happen inside it before the day was out. I thought about the woman I was when I first inherited all of this. 31 years old. Overwhelmed by the paperwork and the responsibility and the grief of losing my father, and completely certain that the man standing beside me was exactly where he was supposed to be. I do not hold anything against that woman. She loved Monroe the way a person is supposed to love someone, without a running total, without suspicion, without a notepad in her kitchen drawer. That kind of love is not foolishness. It is just love. What happened to it was not her fault. I went inside and dressed carefully. I did my hair the way I do for church, every pin in place, nothing rushed. Then I called my oldest friend, and we talked for 40 minutes about her granddaughter's school play and a television program we had both been watching and whether the summer was coming in hotter than last year. I was fully inside every minute of that conversation. I laughed twice and meant it both times. Monique called mid-morning. I told her I had spoken to Jerome and I was ready to move forward with the business. I suggested we all sit down together later in the week to go through the details. I heard the relief move through her voice like air out of something that had been held too tight for too long. I let her have it. I let her believe it was over. She said she was so glad. She said I deserved peace. I told her she was right. Jerome called 20 minutes later. His warmth came out the way it always did. Slightly effortful, slightly too even. The performance of a man who learned early that warmth was useful and never quite forgot he was using it. He told me he was proud of me for moving forward. He said Monroe would have wanted me to be taken care of. I listened to him put Monroe's name in his mouth, and I kept my voice exactly where I needed it to be. I told him I knew he was right. I told him I loved him. I sat with my coffee after he hung up and opened the notepad one last time. 41 entries. Every thread, every date, every word Jerome had said on a recorded line, and every movement Monique's face had made when she thought I was not reading her. I closed it. I would not need it after today. At 2:17, my phone rang. Alton. One sentence. It is done. I set the phone on the table. I folded my hands. Outside, the trees my father planted stood completely still in the afternoon light. I was at home when it happened. That was exactly where I chose to be. Alton had advised against my being present, and I agreed without needing much convincing. Not because I was afraid of what I would feel watching it, but because I had already seen the part that mattered. I had seen Jerome's face when he thought he was managing me. I had seen Monique's hand go still on that coffee cup. I had read every document and sat through every briefing and built every brick of what was now falling on them. I did not need to watch the falling. I already knew what I had built. The warrants had been prepared days earlier. The charging documents were already in place. By the time the arrests happened, the investigation had moved far beyond suspicion and into evidence. Jerome was taken from his office mid-afternoon. Federal agents, in front of the people he worked with, on a Wednesday in Memphis. The charges were specific and exhaustively documented. Deed fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, obstruction. Every forged signature traced and verified. Every fraudulent transfer mapped. Every recorded phone call in which he described his authority over assets he had stolen on paper. Cataloged and time-stamped and ready for a federal prosecutor to stand up and read aloud in a courtroom. Monique was at home when federal investigators came to her door. Alton told me later that she did not run. She did not argue. She went very still when she saw them standing there, the stillness of a woman who had been carrying the weight of a particular dread for long enough that when it finally arrived, it almost felt like relief. She agreed to come in with counsel present and answer questions. I understood that kind of stillness. I had felt it myself sitting on my kitchen floor 4 months ago. The calls started before the hour was out. Jerome's attorney, a cousin I had not spoken to in 3 years, a family friend who left a message that was half comfort and half fishing for information. I let every one of them go to voicemail. I would sit with Alton later in the week and go through them properly. I cooked that evening. A real meal, my mother's smothered chicken. The recipe I had not made since before all of this began because it required the kind of patience and presence I had not been able to spare. I stood in that kitchen and I cooked it properly, every step the way she taught me. And when it was ready, I sat down at the table with the lamp on and the television off. And I ate in the quiet. I thought about Monique while I ate, about the woman who had walked through my front door twice a week for 4 years carrying food and questions, and a warmth that was not entirely false. I had decided that much was true. Jerome brought her into this. She was younger when it started, less formed, standing next to a man she trusted in a situation she may not have fully understood until she was already too deep inside it to see the walls. That did not absolve her. She made choices. She kept coming to my house, knowing what she knew. But I refused to flatten her into something simple just because simple would have been easier to carry. Jerome reached me once. A single call I answered because Alton said it might produce something useful on record. What I heard when the line connected was not the son I had been performing warmth for across 4 months of calculated visits. The performance was entirely gone. What was left underneath it was something younger and more frightened than I had heard from him in years. He said only, "Mama, I am sorry." I listened to those 4 words completely. Then I told him to speak to his lawyer. I ended the call. The FBI agent called just before midnight. Monroe's phone, the one registered to Gerald Warren, had gone dark. He knew. He was moving. I asked how long before they found him. She said they already knew where he was going. They were already there. He made it as far as the Georgia state line. That was the detail the FBI agent gave me when she called at 7:40 the next morning. Not the exact road, not the mile marker, just the fact that he had gotten that far and no further. Monroe had packed a bag. He had withdrawn cash in amounts small enough not to trigger automatic flags. He had a second set of documents in the house, a third identity, fully prepared. The kind of preparation that does not happen overnight. The investigators found everything when they went through his house afterward. Another name, another paper life, another exit waiting in a drawer for the day the current one ran out. He had planned for this the same way he planned for everything else, methodically, without panic, with the particular patience of a man who had been thinking 10 steps ahead of the people around him for 30 years. It was not enough. Not this time. I was sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee when the agent told me Monroe Tyndall was in federal custody, that he would be transported back to Tennessee, that the charges were extensive: insurance fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, identity fraud, and charges connected to the burned car case that went considerably beyond anything financial. The investigators had uncovered what happened to the body. The missing man had died from natural causes while living transiently several counties away. For months, the remains went unclaimed. At the time Monroe staged his disappearance, he had access through a funeral home employee willing to ignore procedures in exchange for money. The remains were improperly released, moved, and later placed inside the vehicle Monroe used in the staged crash. The fire destroyed any possibility of a routine visual identification. Personal effects linked to Monroe were recovered from the scene, and because the remains could not be conclusively identified, the original determination was recorded as a presumed death, with inconclusive remains rather than a confirmed identification. Monroe understood the difference. He built his plan around it. He did not kill the man. He simply used him. He obtained access he should never have had, exploited failures that should never have happened, and built his disappearance around someone who could no longer object. The charges reflected that. So did the outrage from the family who spent 4 years believing their loved one had simply vanished. I said thank you. I set the phone down. I picked up my coffee and I drank it. I thought about the man in that burned car. Not Monroe, the other man. The one reported missing from another county 6 months before Monroe staged his death. Someone's son, someone's brother. A person with a name and a family who spent 4 years not knowing what had become of him because Monroe needed a body and found one and used it without a second thought for the people it would destroy. The fraud Monroe ran against me was personal. What he did to that man and that family was something colder than personal. It was simply convenient. That is the part of this I will carry the longest. Not my own loss, but the loss of a family who never had the chance to grieve properly until a DNA database gave them back what Monroe took. They knew now. That was the only mercy the situation had left to offer them. Alton came to the house that afternoon. We sat at the kitchen table the way we had sat there a dozen times over the past 4 months, except this time there were no new documents to review, no strategy to plan, no performance to prepare. There was only the work still ahead, the federal proceedings, the asset recovery process, The legal challenges to the forged deeds and the fraudulent loans. Months of it, still. I knew that going in, and I was not troubled by it. I had learned in the past 4 months that I was considerably more capable of sustained, precise effort than I had previously given myself credit for. Alton set his cup down at one point and looked at me across the table. He said he had been practicing law for 31 years. He said he had worked with clients who hired private investigators, clients who retained forensic accountants, clients who had entire legal teams running parallel tracks. He said he had never seen one person run a 4-month private investigation with the consistency and precision I had brought to this. I told him my father used to say that the most dangerous thing a person can be is underestimated. I told him Monroe had been underestimating me for 28 years. Alton nodded slowly and picked his cup back up. He was at the door, jacket on, when he turned back. He said there was one more thing I should know. Felicia Stafford had contacted the FBI voluntarily after the story broke. She had no knowledge of any of the fraud. She had 2 children and no income now beyond what Monroe had been providing. She was not facing charges, but she had nothing. He left. I sat with that for a long time. 8 months is not a long time, not against 28 years. The federal attorneys told me the proceedings moved faster than cases of this complexity typically do. Jerome's early guilty plea and Monique's cooperation with prosecutors collapsed what could have stretched across 2 years into a series of hearings that moved with a kind of clean, deliberate efficiency that I found each time I sat in that front row in my good coat and my good shoes. Deeply satisfying. Jerome pleaded guilty to 4 counts. I was present the morning he did it. He did not look at me when he entered the plea. I did not need him to. Monique cooperated fully. Her testimony against Monroe was detailed in the way that only someone who had lived inside the machinery of something could make it. Specific dates, specific conversations, specific instructions passed through her from a man in Georgia to a woman in Memphis who was running his errands while I served her tea. Her testimony cost her something. I could see it in her face on the day she gave it. Not remorse exactly, but the particular exhaustion of a person dismantling the last version of a life they had built around the wrong foundation. She received a reduced charge. I did not object to that. Her testimony put Monroe in that courtroom, and I needed him in that courtroom. Monroe did not plead guilty. Of course he did not. He sat across from me for 3 days of federal proceedings, and I watched him the way I had watched him across the breakfast table for 28 years, steadily, without flinching, reading the space between what he showed and what he felt. He was composed. He had always been composed. But I knew now what composure cost him and what it was covering, and I was no longer moved by it in any direction. He was convicted on every count. The sentence was substantial. Monroe Tyndall, who had planned 30 years of his life in careful, patient detail, would spend the remainder of it inside a federal institution. He would be an old man before he saw free air again, maybe longer. The deeds were unwound. 3 of the fraudulent loans were discharged entirely once the forgery was established in court. The catering business was restored to my name. The properties were mine. The accounts were mine. Everything my father built across 40 years of discipline in this city, everything Monroe spent the length of our marriage quietly draining, was returned to me by the same legal system he had counted on being too slow and too complicated for a grieving widow to navigate. He miscalculated. 3 months before the business reopened, I made a decision I told no one about. I sent an anonymous money order to Felicia Stafford's address, enough to give her time to find work, to stabilize, to build something that was actually hers and not constructed on top of someone else's lie. Not because Monroe deserved any extension of my mercy, because Felicia's children did not choose their father, because my own father raised me to know the difference between holding someone accountable and punishing someone innocent for standing too close to the guilty. I kept that between myself and God. The morning I reopened the kitchen, my oldest friend was there. We stood together in that space, and she looked around at the shelves and the equipment and the binder of my father's handwritten recipes, sitting exactly where it had always sat. And she said he would be so proud. I thought about his hands, his laugh, the way he said that everything they tried to take from you, your name, your dignity, your legacy, you could always rebuild it if you refused to let them have the last word. I refused. I am Beverly Tyndall. I am standing in my father's kitchen, in my father's city, in a life that is entirely and only mine. I turn on the stove. I have work to do.